Hey there, 8th graders, and welcome. Get ready because today we are laying down the absolute foundation for literally everything we're going to do in science this year. Think of this explainer as your ultimate pre-lab preparation for our flipped classroom. Before you even step foot in the laboratory tomorrow to get your hands messy with actual experiments, you need a solid mental toolkit. We're going to cover exactly how scientists think, how they set up tests, and the tools they use to measure and share their discoveries. So go ahead and make sure your digital interactive science notebooks are open and ready because you are definitely going to want to take notes on this. Okay, let's just dive right in. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We've got 1, welcome to LEGO Universe, 2, observations versus inferences, 3, mastering the scientific variables, 4, measurement and SI units, and finally 5, analyzing and graphing data. Starting off with section 1, welcome to LEGO Universe, the branches of science. I want you to think about matter and energy as the absolute most basic building blocks of the universe. It's kind of like individual Lego bricks. If we look at it this way, physics is all about studying a single simple Lego block and its specific properties. Things like how fast it falls when you drop it, or the energy it transfers when it smacks into the floor. Chemistry? That's the study of how those different Lego blocks actually transform and fit together to make totally new things, like when you mix vinegar and baking soda to make a bubbling volcano. Then we have life science, or biology. That studies all of the incredibly complex, living things that are built out of millions of these Legos, from microscopic single-celled organisms all the way up to massive whales. And earth science deals with the colossal, non-living structures in our Lego world, mapping out planets, stars, and erupting tectonic plates. So, now that we know what parts of the Lego universe we can actually study, how do we go about studying them? In your digital notebooks, you'll be using what's called the 5E inquiry framework. It goes like this. First, you engage by making initial observations of some cool phenomenon, just to spark a few questions. Then you get your hands dirty and explore through active, hands-on investigations. Once you've gathered some solid data, you explain and describe the concepts you just discovered. Next up, you take that brand new knowledge and elaborate by extending your understanding to completely new real-world situations. And finally, you evaluate to assess your final results and see if your ideas actually hold up. It's really the perfect step-by-step cycle for discovery. Moving right along to section 2, observations versus inferences, thinking like a scientist. To successfully navigate that 5E process we just talked about, you really have to train your brain. The absolute most crucial point is understanding the difference between an observation and an inference. An observation is completely factual. It is just noticing a specific detail using your 5 senses. For example, say you look at a scene and see that ice cream fell out of a cone onto the ground. That is a fact. An inference, however, is when you take that observation and make a guess or interpret a meaning based on the visual evidence. Saying she is mad she dropped her ice cream is an inference. You're guessing her emotional state based on the fact that the ice cream is on the ground, but you don't actually know that for sure. Think about it like this. When we observe, we are just gathering the hard data. We see a girl with pink shoes, we see a black trash can, and we see ice cream down on the pavement. But when we start to infer, that's where we start building a story in our heads. We might infer she's upset and crying, or maybe we infer that a parent didn't let her have the ice cream, which is why it ended up on the ground in the first place. As a scientist, you must always start with pure observations before you ever try to infer the meaning. Honestly, jumping to conclusions too early ruins good science. Which brings us to section 3, mastering the scientific variables, the FAIR test. Whenever we set up an experiment, we are dealing with variables. And a variable is simply anything that can change in an experiment. But there are 3 specific types you absolutely must memorize to ensure what we call a FAIR test. First is the independent variable. This is what you, the experimenter, intentionally change or manipulate. Second is the dependent variable. This is what you measure. It's the response to whatever you just changed. And finally, the control variables. These are the things that must stay exactly the same. Listen, having more than one independent variable means your experiment is not a FAIR test. If you change the height of a ramp and the weight of a toy car at the exact same time, you'll literally have no idea which change actually caused the car to roll faster. Let's look at how these variables map out in action. Imagine an experiment where we're testing to see which liquid makes a plant grow best. The independent variable, the one thing we are intentionally changing, is the type of liquid. Maybe it's soda, juice, or water. The dependent variable is what we're measuring at the very end, which is the height or growth of the plant. But for this to actually be a FAIR test, we have to look at the control variables. Notice how every single plant is in the exact same red pot? They have the exact same amount of soil, and they're kept in the exact same light conditions. If one plant was sitting in a dark closet and another was sitting in the bright sun, you couldn't make a valid conclusion about the liquid because the light totally interfered. All right, Section 4, Measurement and SI Units, the physical tools. Go ahead and pause here for a second to make sure this table gets recorded in your digital science notebook. It is absolutely crucial. You see, scientists all over the world need to understand each other's data effortlessly, so they use the International System of Units, or SI units. When measuring length, the standard unit is the meter. For the volume of a liquid, it's the liter. When we measure mass, which is just the amount of matter in an object, we use grams. For temperature, scientists use Celsius, and for time, the standard is the second. Using these standards ensures that a brilliant experiment done right here in our 8th grade classroom makes perfect sense to a scientist working in a lab on the other side of the planet. Let's move on and see how this actually translates into your physical lab work tomorrow. Because you aren't just dealing with abstract ideas here, you'll be handling real physical tools. When you need to measure length in meters or centimeters, you'll reach for the trusty meter stick. When you need to find the exact mass of a rock or some chemical powder in grams, you'll slide the weights on a triple beam balance until it clicks perfectly into place. Matching the correct physical tool to the required SI unit is just a fundamental skill for any successful lab investigation. And finally, Section 5, Analyzing and Graphing Data, Translating the Results. All right, so you've observed, you've controlled your variables, and you've used your SI tools to measure out a bunch of quantitative data. Now, what do you actually do with all those numbers? You organize them to share your results. When it comes to taking your data and putting it on a graph, I want you to remember one simple, perfect acronym. Dry mix. It tells you exactly where your variables belong on a line or bar graph. Dry stands for dependent responding y-axis. Your dependent variable, the one you measured with your ruler or balance, always goes on the vertical y-axis. Mix stands for manipulated independent x-axis. The variable you intentionally changed goes on the horizontal x-axis. Memorize dry mix, and honestly, you will never draw a graph backward again. But sometimes the quantitative data you collect is just incredibly bulky. And let's be real for a second. Scientists can be a little lazy when it comes to writing. If they have to write the mass of a planet in grams or the size of a microscopic cell, they really don't want to write out a dozen zeros. That is exactly where scientific notation comes in. Instead of writing out 137,000, they compress it into a number between 1 and 10, and then multiply it by a power of 10. So it effortlessly becomes 1.37 times 10 to the 8th power. It's a brilliant shortcut for managing massive or tiny measurements without completely cramping your hand. Now, keeping all that in mind, not all data belongs on a line graph with an x and y axis. Sometimes you're dealing with categories or percentages, parts of a whole. That's when you'll use a pie chart or a donut chart. If you're looking at a classroom and calculating that 50% of students chose group A, 25% chose B, and 25% chose C, a circular chart visually represents those degrees and percentages perfectly. Anyone can look at it and instantly know which group is the biggest. Knowing which type of graph to use is honestly just as important as knowing how to draw it. So, we've covered the Lego branches, the 5E framework, observations versus inferences, the incredibly important variables, SI units, and graphing. It all leads to the final step, writing a valid conclusion. Remember, a valid conclusion can only be written after your data is properly recorded, and it must clearly state the relationship between your independent and dependent variables. It's where you answer if your hypothesis was supported or not. You now have the ultimate scientist toolkit completely downloaded right into your brain. The only question left is, with all the mysteries hidden in the Lego universe around us, what are you going to discover first?